Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. There has been a tremendous amount of chatter over the past year about NFTs, how they're a scam, how they'll usher in a new era of democratized Web3 for the entire planet, and everything in between. Tonight, we're joined by someone with an unusual background who is unusually well placed to help us get to the bottom of this. Michael Maizels is a former professor of art history who made the somewhat non-traditional pivot into crypto. He is now the head of research at Abra, where he works on subjects like Bitcoin mining and climate change and the security vulnerabilities of blockchain bridges. If you enjoyed this interview, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com.
Michael, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the project you're working on today.
For sure. So the long story of me, quickly, wanted to be an artist, wasn't a very good artist, realized I was much more interested in some ways in history, and wound up doing a PhD in modern contemporary art history, appropriately enough, at the University of Virginia. Wanted to be either a museum curator or an art history professor. Did each of those things for about 3 years and recognized that I had come up against the limits of what an academic career was going to make possible. So one semester before I was basically going to get a semi-guaranteed tenure at the University of Arkansas, I decided to leave a forever job and do an accelerated MBA program at MIT. It's just a very interesting, like 1 year kind of career change MBA. Out of that, I got a job working at a kind of corporate innovation studio in San Francisco, and am now the head of research for Abra, which is a global cryptocurrency exchange headquartered in Mountain View, though I still reside outside of Boston. Because while we are talking about personal origin stories, part of how I came to this crux in my career was that I sort of got invited to join as a semi-permanent affiliate at a think tank at Harvard called the Metal Lab. Joining a think tank, as you may or may not know, is not always a paid position, right, but it is an interesting one. So the head of the lab basically said, you can stick around here doing whatever you want with us forever if you can just go get any other job anywhere that isn't back in Arkansas. I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting. So out of that, kind of back calculated what was the most interesting applied industry complement to being at a creative technology design studio think tank at Harvard. And as a cultural historian thinking about the future intersection of technology, markets, et cetera, I started to watch crypto and I started to think about NFTs and the ways that they, I don't want to say we're transforming the art world, but we're making the jokes literal. There was something about how there is a kind of humor that's rooted in stating the obvious, and it seemed as though many of the NFT projects that managed to capture significant attention, your Bored Ape is probably the clearest example of this, but there are others, were taking things like the idea that art, it wasn't really about art, it was about being an insider club, and made it a literal, explicit piece of the roadmap, right? Picasso maybe isn't interesting, Da Vinci is or isn't interesting, Warhol is or isn't interesting, but, we're doing a collector's dinner. That was always the point. Now here it's the explicit point. And there was something about that was compelling, right? And there's a strong line in my discipline of origin that would see that as cynical. And to me, I think that may be true, but I think many of the best avant-gardes have been cynical, or been cynical in moments, or been cynical and then gleeful in the destruction of what it was they were lighting on fire. And that it seems to me there's a lot of bad faith in a discipline that will say yes to Andy Warhol in favor of new identities, new ways of making meaning, new audiences, new technologies, new, like even subject positions with his relationship with Basquiat, call it, right? First African-American canonical artist comes in the art world because Warhol. Okay, fine. Okay, yes, we like all that, but we don't like NFTs because what?
No reason at all. Yeah.
So, right. So, exactly. No circle squaring reason at all, right? Reason, certainly, but no justifiable reasons, in my opinion, in light of the Warhol skepticism. So, decided, fuck it, let's join the pirate party and see how this goes. So that was sort of what led me to the doorstep of Abra. I am now heading up a major research initiative, which will culminate in a journal that's currently called The Pulse, but I'm considering retitling. Trent, love to talk to you about this offline. Sure. But it will be a 4 times a year. I don't want to call it a scholarly journal because we're not yet doing formal peer review. That is something I would like to explore doing in the future. But a journal that takes the rigor and seriousness of academic research to bear in mind communication that would be industry useful. That's a very clumsy way of saying heavy footnotes, research-driven, academic and high-level industry practitioners pointing towards directions for new areas of exploration, as yet still a little light on fundamental research, but again, things we're going to grow towards in the future, to serve as a clearinghouse, right? Because I think that for me, cryptocurrencies are interesting because they're the units of a new internet. And that the internet that everyone is familiar with is the internet of data. So we can sit here and share video data and audio data and location data and social media browsing history data and all the fucking data we want until we're blue in the face for free for all intents and purposes, paid advertising, whatever. That's the internet of data. Now imagine cryptocurrencies are the atomic unit, rather than of sharing data, of sending value. Right? So that's non-local cash transfer, non-local ownership transfer, right?
The internet of money.
Then the internet of money, right? What's the Google Maps of money, or the Wikipedia of ownership, or, like the Spotify of SEC disclosure, right? It could be fucking anything in a way that it's really hard to imagine. I was sort of inspired by futurist Alvin Toffler, who would try to make some of these like transitions between one idiom and another. And to me, the closest thing I could think of as an analogy would be, imagine trying to describe Uber to somebody in 1980 and being forced to the dumb recourse of its taxis over the telephone. Right. That's as much clarity as we could possibly have about what it is we're trying to build. But that, to me, is the direction in which it's all built, right? And what field of human endeavor is not subject to some degree of disruption around new ways of paying and new ways of owning? I would argue very little. So I had always been something of an academic polymath. I thought it was like fun to go collect co-authorships from like the geography department and the tax law history department and the Department of Peruvian Study. You name it. It was like a fun game to see how far I could kind of cast the die. And it turned out to be a weird background preparatory training for trying to produce significant academic coverage in discipline X. So we're going to try, issue 1 coming together, issue 2 planned, issue 3, big old question mark.
So it sounds like you view NFTs as being an important new innovation in art, not just in terms of content, but in terms of the medium itself. So I want to explore that relationship in as much depth as you want to go to, but I thought we could start with a foundational question, hopefully a nice, easy one. In your view, what is art?
Oh, this is so easy. So folks come to an idea that art is a thing. It's a universal. Like, what is art, right? Art is universal. Art is for everyone. And this is I want to call it a cultural attitude that is, I don't want to say caused by museums, but it's common in museums, right? It's often where a public has an encounter with art. Museums ought to be free. Art is for everybody. Art is universal. Art is timeless. This is like a rhetoric I can kind of gesture towards. And I would say that rhetoric does a lot to misunderstand what art actually is. And I think that, to use, an analogy from another field, I would often tell my students that stories maybe are universal, right? It would be hard to point at a culture that didn't, by one means or another, tell stories. But novels are very culturally specific. They arise in Britain somewhere between the 17th and the 19th century, and they have all kinds of specific relationships to the printing press, public education, a bourgeoisie with a day job and a weekend who wants to take a book with them onto the beach. All those things always hang together around novels. Art is more like novels than it is like stories. It's a specific construct that in some ways version 1.0 comes into existence in the Renaissance. We can double click on any of this. I could talk about any of these topics just for 90 minutes just alone. So just know that, and I won't. Renaissance and then modernism, right? Picasso era, that's when the modern art market, it's when the secondary market is born, right? One of the differences you can think about between something in a Michelangelo day, a Ninja Turtle day, as I was fond of calling it, and a Picasso day, is it's the difference between patronage and collecting, right? You only patronize the people that live in your castle, but you can collect the work of anybody who might have even come before you. It's a secondary market for it, right? Again, you can kind of see these things kind of tracking along. So I think art is this bounded construct, right? It's like religion, a religion. And I didn't make this up. This is like Hegel and Kant talking about this, and they're right because everybody listened to them afterwards, which made them right. You know, they didn't discover this like, you know, the golden ratio. It's a concept. It's like, this is how Kant described it. The beautiful was the purposive purposelessness. So it's like I'm looking at my garden and you can look at a flower and you can look at what makes the rose beautiful is it's so intricate for no reason that seems functional, right? It turns out, well, yeah, it's like a biology. Kant looking at this through, you know, probably not very good, you know, 18th century spectacles, it sees something that seems extraneously aesthetic. That's what he means by art, right? And then Hegel kind of comes in and points out that this worshiping of this purposelessness, this purposeful purposelessness has taken the place of religion in modern society, right? It's a thing to stand in front of and go, holy fuck, I'm in awe of how blah this is, right? Instead of religion, it's art. It's filling the same need. So this thing that ought to be free, bounded, and exist and floatable and collectible, but be the same job that God used to do for you, that's what art is, and it gets invented in the middle 18th century, just like novels did.
And then how does crypto play into that NFTs, this next iteration?
So the story starts there, but the story doesn't stop there, right? So, you know, the heart of the reason that you're not the only person to ask me for the definition of art, right? And there's a certain kind of like, okay, this makes sense as a beginning place, in part because artists were so fond of asking that question for so long, right? And in some ways, every chapter you see divided in an art history textbook is a different kind of answer to that question, right? Like art is about feelings. Okay, sure, maybe that's like mannerism or something. It's also in some ways surrealism. It's also, you know, in some ways things that from the 1970s that happened after that, right? Art is about supra-realism. It's about pictures of the world that are more accurate than photographs can ever possibly be because there's human agency to construct something that's realer than real. Okay. Right. That's it's another
selective.
Answer.
It's a selective process, right?
Yeah, somebody's got it's the same, like I got a new idea for a like organic soda company, right? Like we're going to do sarsaparilla and rosemary. This is why this is the best flavor combo, right? That's the game. Bring a new product to market, convince the audience that that's where the world needs to head, build consensus around that, hopefully find a way to monetize it, hopefully find a way to not die broke. That game's been going on probably since ideas have been going on, right? And it's the same rhythm that drives forward the art world. It's part of what brought screen printing. That's Warhol, again, kind of refusing the singular, heroic, painterly mark making from Pollock. It's what brings that to the foreground, right? It's what brings feminist art to the foreground. It's what brings graffiti to the foreground, right? There's all kinds of, you know, I'll allude to problematic slippages that happen along the way there in the kind of very, very broad brush stories that I'm telling. But to me, NFTs is screen prints or engravings. It's like a way of having the art exist in multiple or, you know, it turns out in singular, right? Because again, I'm not, you know, far from the first person to point this out. The NFT is a signature of ownership, right? So to me, like one of my favorite artists is an artist named Robert Barry, who was kind of prominent in the early 1970s. And one of his, I think, most genius pieces, and just the most genius piece, just in general, he would drive out to the desert and with tanks of inert noble gases, right, like helium or neon, and release them for a second. And that released gas, which was documented in a photograph, again, that's absurd because it's a photograph of an empty air, right, is a sculpture. But it's like a sculpture that's the least possible. It's like an asymptotic sculpture. It comes into existence, then isn't anymore.
Like
it's
the
invisible.
null set the null set.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a random walk over the null set almost. It's invisible, weightless, undetectable, impermanent. Like, what is that, right? It's religion. Oh my God, it's God, the absence, and the soul. And you can see kissing the threshold of mortality, right, of birth and death, right through there. Cool. That's pretty sick, bro. But like, what does it mean to own that? I don't know, but it's pretty weird, I'm sure, right? I don't think to date it's been weird enough. And I think NFTs have a way of, a promise, I'll call them, rather than a way of like queering ownership in the way Warhol queered, mark making, let's call it. Making it diverse and bizarre and organized in all kinds of ways that would have been impermissible under the previously overly strict Victorian regime.
Thomas, I have a follow-up, but I wanted to see if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, let me ask this. I've often heard the 3 O's of NFTs, which is proof of originality, proof of ownership, and oh, no, I forget the third one here. And I was going to ask you if that is a good way of describing it.
I think so. I mean, I guess like an NFT is like a deed, but it's like a deed that can be made liquid and fungible in any of the ways that digital files can be made liquid and fungible, right? So I think, to me, the power of the NFT as a generalized system was made the most clear there's a great podcast with Raoul Paul and Punk 6529, and he says something about the rhetoric around these conversations is occluded by the fact that so much of this is tied up in the language of smart contracts and all of these assets like living on chain. But it turns out that NFTs can secure the rights to own anything on or off chain. And his analogy was, think about the system of deeds, like writing down who owns what parcel of land and giving people a certificate and also keeping a copy in, a trusted repository, right? And comparing A against B. That system has been working well since it was possible to own land in any sense of the meaning of that word, right? And land is ultimately off-chain for deeds, and yet the deed system works. So now imagine a registry where you can own facets of something, right? And I think part of my attraction to this space is I became friends with a couple of like ex-bankers when I was doing my MBA, and we would talk about the different kinds of just exotic financial instruments that they would work with, tranches and derivative securities and all of these different kinds of things. I was totally foreign and strange to me. And I thought, like, this is the kind of thing that artists do in a certain way. They take bits of the world and remix them until they find what they think the greatest novelty and value mixture is that nobody's quite thought of the recipe they thought of. And I was very interested to see how new expressive possibilities, which are clearly coming into the world with all of these different kinds of tools for art making, synthetic media, Trent, that was the kind of thing I was alluding to before the call about generation beta. There's a lot of new ways of making whatever art turns out to be. Oh, there's God. Oh, it isn't. But like, what are the boundaries around that? Anything, right? And I think that as art wants to push itself into ever more ambitious self-formations, creating a financial corollary to that in which the form can match the genre is good. And I'm interested in that as a design problem, how things can be both creatively and financially interesting as facets of one another.
So just to clarify, the 3 O's are the proof of origin, the proof of originality, and the proof of ownership.
Sure. I think that's like a way of so the analogy that I would use there is it's a fine way of breaking down the primary colors of painting, like, okay, there's red, there's green, there's blue. They can be mixed together in these different combinations and produce these kinds of things. But then, like, how do you describe what the boundaries of painting are? To me, I feel like it's better to gesture at what it's trying to accomplish. It's trying to make you feel a certain way. It's trying to make you connect with an artist across space and time. It's trying to put an unexpressible feeling into an associational image. Like that can definitely be understood at the level of what colors are the paint and what is the paint made out of chemically. But I think it's more like in more dimension is better understood as what it's supposed to be a painting of or about or why it came into being. So I think the ownership origin originality piece is useful, but I think it's missing the forest for the trees, at least from my way of looking at the world.
Yeah, a friend of mine is working in the real estate world and trying to create NFTs for houses, only these are dynamic NFTs that end up being a compendium of all of the things that happened to the house. When did the roof get changed last time? When did they change the hot water heater? And each of these...
That's a good idea.
Is that Grobecker? Is that Teresa Grobecker?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, we interviewed her back in episode 68, I think.
Yeah. So I found that to be very interesting. And the plan is once you have an NFT with that compendium of all the information about a house, then you don't have to have inspections done. You don't have to have all these extra delays in buying and selling real estate. And so then theoretically you can close almost instantly on a new property. And I was bringing up the part I wanted to know about if the house smelled like cat pee or not. And that's a really hard thing to incorporate into an NFT.
Or what is the feng shui like? Like that,
right.
That kind of a thing. And I think that's almost sort of what the Robert Barry piece is maybe more accurately about. It's like, what is that little bit of extra that makes something art, or that adheres in the thing that is art and doesn't seem to in the thing that isn't, and like, surely some of that has to be subjective, right? Things that appear extra, whether it's like extra bad, what does it smell like? What is the feng shui like? It's the feng shui going to feel slightly different to different people. And I think that's part of, art is universal, right? It looks different to everybody. Sure. Okay. I'll buy that. But I think that when thinking about spaces that are as potentially massive to disrupt as ownership, it can be helpful to try to land back on specifics around that. But I feel like, again, that diminishes your chance to understand how bizarre all of this could come to be if anything like 30% of the maximalist vision of it comes true.
Why don't you sketch that maximalist vision for us just a little bit?
Oh, God. I will just tell your readers to see two different things, to read two different interrelated things. A book called Radical Markets by Glenn Weil, which came out maybe in 2017, and then a paper that Weil just published with himself, one of the researchers whose name I'm forgetting, and I feel badly about that, and Vitalik Buterin, right? So the hypothesis of radical markets, do you readers yourselves familiar with the ideas of Henry George? Is that a name that is going to ring the economic doorbell? Yes.
Yeah, George, yeah.
So basically it's like techno-Georgism, where central assets like land are owned by something like a government, but maybe it's the Tao as a collective, but it's something. And any use of them, such as building a house on top of it, is a permissioned use that is paid for as a rent, rather than as like, something that you ever yourself get to own outright. You never get to own outright the land. You might own the lumber that you use to build the house on top of it, but you don't own the property in the American sense of the word, right? This is in some ways what the Chinese version of communism looks like. Weil has some very far-reaching ideas about how the Uber, Airbnb looking sharing economy has been a dress rehearsal for doing this, is proof of concept, is an inadvertent searching by the population for wanting to do this the whole time, right? And proposes in some ambitiously granular detail what it would look like to live in a version of techno-Georgism, where instead of owning your car, you have an app that gives you a car share, or maybe more than one app, because maybe there's more than one competing government regime to control things, and maybe that's better or worse, or I don't even know, right? Okay, with that gloss, That author just published a paper with Buterin about this new concept of soul-bound tokens, which is just as scary as it sounds like. What these are supposed to be are non-transferable tokens. You cannot transfer them after you've been given them, that will do things like replace your degrees. So, I went to some fancy school and I paid to go there, partly to, I could tell people I went there, right? This accomplishes the same kind of thing where you're given a token that can be a part of your wallet, can be a part of your Web3 LinkedIn, whatever that looks like and means. It's your proof of attendance of, at some developer conference, at some school, at some anything, right? You can also do this, as they point out, for all kinds of less serious reasons that almost demonstrate the reaches of this thing as tentacles, right? You could give these out for people who went to go to every home game by the Red Sox. You can also do kinds of interesting things where the token itself may not be tradable, but maybe it generates a very small cash flow that can be traded, right? It's like some kind of mint burn token thing, and you can literally enrich yourself by holding the thing, and maybe the token you generate, that itself, can be sold in the open market. Okay, fine. That's like another way of approaching this. But to think about what the foundation of techno-Georgism, where it's your life, except you open your 3D, Web3, multi-identity passport thing, and you access theoretically anything, right? Everything, right? Where does your kid go to school? Where do you get car insurance from? Who do you pay taxes to? Who do you call when the sewer exploded, right? All of those things are ostensibly being made to interoperate, but you can't own anything anymore. You got to rent it from everybody. Everybody rents it from each other. Okay, sure. That system for sure is going to work smoothly and not disrupt the daily function of human lives and government services in a way its maximalists seem ready to hold themselves accountable for doing.
Yeah, in the past, we've worked on a project called the Whole Earth Genealogy Project, and we thought it'd be really interesting if each person had this kind of a cell that was their space and this whole grid map of human genealogy as we figured out how all of these pieces fit together. And kind of what you're talking about there reminds me of this project that you fit into this genealogical geography, so to speak, in a way, and you can use that as the kind of the peg, the storing house for all of the information about yourself, all of the experiences you've had, and all the things you own and have done, and but then you run into all the privacy issues surrounding that as well.
Right. I wanted to ask about that.
Only if you think they're issues. So again, this part of the baseline assumption here is that privacy withers. Right? Or maybe it becomes some other thing and it's a paid privileged privacy access to use the privacy browser. But anybody you're paying to have access for the privilege of privacy is no longer genuine privacy.
Right.
What are the arguments?
Yeah.
What are the arguments for it not being a problem? I mean, the potential failure modes just abound in my mind.
Yeah. Oh, and I don't think this, I think 30% would be an extremely bullish case of how much of this is going to come true. But it's hard to know, right? Because it's one of these things that, stuff doesn't get adopted until it really gets fucking adopted. And what is that break point going to look like? The thing that I can say that convinced me to leap into the crypto industry is I saw a figure in a Masari report that was pulled from a different report from the consultancy Edelman that came out before COVID, just before COVID hit. And they interviewed people from all over the world and asked them about their public institutions, banks, governments, churches, museums, hospitals, attorneys, you name it. And they asked them to rank these entities on the axes of trustworthiness and effectiveness. And there was no public institution anywhere that was considered both trustworthy and competent.
Wow.
Okay.
Think about that. And I think, to me, that looks like a societal breakpoint that's accelerated by the pandemic. And there's all kinds of Black Death, COVID parallels here. And I think that not too much longer after the Black Death, right? And again, the timelines are a little screwy and they're definitely much more accelerated in the present moment. You wind up with the successful uptake of the movable type printing press, primitive versions of which had existed for a long time, but something, hit a critical mass and poof, there it went. And what it was a system for making multiple copies of something everybody could see. And everybody could have the master copy live on their own nightstand rather than trusting that we'd leave it, in the Pope's cathedral and he'll just tell us what it says.
Right.
Okay. So you're trying to predict the possible use cases for printed information circa 1605. What do you think democracy is going to look like? What do you think, the Industrial Revolution, when all of this allows scientists to compare notes and invent something like the fucking steam engine, let alone the jet engine? Not too much longer after that. I think that it's like, the opposite of going broke. It's like not very much happens until everything that happens all of the time, up or down, I guess.
The inversion of that Hemingway quote. I was thinking about that as you were talking.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Or it's like, how did everything change? Exactly the same way, not very much. And then all at once. And it's that when that makes all of this so tough in some ways. And I think too, to kind of go back to this, the Toffler piece, he's amazing. I would definitely encourage all of your readers to go read Future Shock from 1970. It's a great 50th anniversary, again, that just came out just before COVID. And he makes some unbelievable prescient observations about what he thinks the fault lines are going to be around technological change accelerating, generational differences, societal attitudes towards alternative lifestyles. It's amazing how much he got right so early. And then he says, okay, well, bracketing in mind all the usual caveats, I'm going to go ahead and make some predictions on the basis of my analysis. And the two fields that he picks that we're going to dominate the near-term future post-1970 are undersea mining and global weather control.
Wow.
Just big, fat swing and a miss. Just nothing close to hitting that change up, And it shows you how right you can be at closing your eyes and gripping the wall forward rather than imagining into the open darkness, still with your eyes closed and saying, oh, I know where the chair is.
Yeah, it's an iterative and responsive approach to future.
Yes.
Or
and you
frame
have
adjustments.
to, I think, be feeling your way along the fault lines that you think are going to be the break points rather than guessing what you think the outcome of that vector collision is going to be. Right? Because even what vectors are going to collide, let's just even start with that, right? And I think that there are enough of them that are important enough that don't get, at least maybe I'm not following the right people, I'm kind of like new to the industry, but don't get discussed in these kinds of, this isn't a content marketing cycle. This is like a 10-year cycle. And what is actually going to happen here, right? And I think one of the ones that I've become the most interested in, again, has to do with generational cleavage. I think that's, and partly I'm indebted to Toffler there, because I think that's one of the things that you're able to see the most objectively and will have the most certain persistence into the future, right? What it's going to mean may change, but, proportions of who is coming of age of what society and what kind of generationally defining events so far, it's not bad. If you're going to project into the future, to extrapolate based on certain trends, demography is not a bad, place to be in. And I think that there is a generational break in crypto that doesn't get discussed very much between, the OGs. You see this around Luna, right? Like a lot of people freaked out and lost their minds. A lot of people were like, been here before, right? Exactly. Because some of them have been here before and some of them are new. And those that have been here before, a lot of them have a reason for being there that is at odds with the reason for being there a lot of the newbies are there for, right? So this is a fight that is going to be brewing, I think, over the fate of the cryptocurrency ecosystem. The OGs, by and large, to paint with a big brush, are Bitcoiners. They're sort of in it for a revolution of the sovereign individual.
Right.
They tend, in my rough view of the space, to tilt older, white, and male. It just is what it is. Conversely, a lot of the newbies are in here for reasons that are closer to that Buterin piece we were discussing earlier, which is a revolution of the communitarian. This is a new way for all of us to own something together and share it and allow the incentives to be shared and the resources to be shared amongst us all. Those impulses to be self-sovereign and to be more tightly community beholden is going to be very difficult to recognize, not to recognize, to reconcile. And what that reconciliation process looks like and means is going to do a lot to determine what shape all of this takes falling out behind it.
I find that an interesting claim. Why do you think it would be so hard to reconcile? Because to me, and maybe I'm just being naive or not giving all the nuances due, it seems relatively straightforward. I choose to enter into a contract with a potentially unbounded number of people via the mechanism of a token or some sort of incentive system which is built on top of blockchain. But I can withdraw anytime I want to. So I'm both sovereign and communally oriented.
100%. And that sounds very much like the kind of thing Weil would say, right? This is like the best of both worlds. We get the free choice of capitalism. We get the sharing voluntarily, associationally, by design of, a socialist system. Everybody gets good daycare and everybody can have like slick looking tech jobs and still keep their big salaries. Like, okay, for sure. Like that does sound great. I agree with you. If that's how things unfolded, it would be a desirable, positive outcome. But I think that there are all kinds of just even to start with the idea of game theory, right? That I think a lot of the Bitcoiners bring an ethos that this is a one-shot negotiation interacting with a counterparty. And I think a lot of the soul-bound tokens people bring this is the first of a series of interactions that are expected to last arbitrarily long. And I think you bring a different way of interacting with the world in behind with you, right? I think this goes back just exactly to the cat pee argument. I think the apartments are going to look like they look like on the blockchain, but some of them will have cat pee in them, right? I think the motivations that are brought in, the invisible, the ineffable, the neon gas that is attending why you're doing something is going to color how you do it, how reliably you do it, what kinds of incentive systems you are or are not willing to agree to, right? And a mismatch between those kinds of expectations, I think, I don't know. It's going to be interesting. So my personal take on all of this is that the communitarians are going to win because they're the ones that are building something that's going to keep being more and more different from itself, as opposed to Bitcoin sort of is what it is. Like, it's great to be in early on it. I don't know if we're still early, these different, it'll be worth 100K a Bitcoin. Maybe, again, off undersea mining and weather control. It doesn't really matter what I think about, whether or not one asset is going to hit some number or not. But I think that it's, at least for me, hard to imagine that smart contracts was a wrong turn and that everything else that gets built on top of that is going to get built on top of that. And that's about how do we bind each other together with an ever more precisely calibrated incentive alignment plan. And I think not everybody is going to want to be a part of a honeybee setup. And I think who does and doesn't want that and who's allowed to participate in society in those ways or not is going to be something people fight over with a lot of intensity and stakes and feeling.
So you see the basic fault line, to continue that analogy, as being between the communitarians and the old school types that are more interested in the sovereign individual. And ultimately you think that the use cases for the more communitarian approach will win out.
Yes.
What's the, evidence for that so far? Because I'm not properly a Bitcoin maxi. I'm very interested in smart contracts and I'm very interested in tokenomics. But so far, I don't know that anybody's really gotten anything off the ground. And so I'm just curious as to what initial signs you see pointing in that direction.
For sure. And I think I'm trying to think of how I want to answer this question. I think it's still too early to tell, right? I think that just as you were talking a minute ago about NFTs and property, right? Oh, just imagine, the resolution of the pain point around a closing that takes a month collapsing down to 45 minutes. Whether or not it's feasible, it's a different thing, but just the value to be created for doing that and doing things like that multiplied by every field in which there's some intermediary that takes too long to do the damn thing, right? Again, that's the same kind of value prop of Uber of money, you don't need to be a Mr. Monopoly anymore to have a black car show up at your house. You need a phone and a button and it'll show up at your house, right? If DeFi can do to money what Uber did to transportation, the world will be better off to some extent or another, and it'll probably enrich some people more unfairly than others. Probably a lot of people will go broke. The involvement of retail trading and all of this is something I have very complicated ethical feelings about that I'm still sort of, working out for myself. I think very few people were pressured, but for one reason or another, into doing Bitcoin or doing Ethereum or doing whatever, right? So I think your voluntary association piece of this is certainly still on point for that. It's too early to tell, right? All of these things are theoretically possible, but they don't necessarily feel like they're super theoretically far away. One of the most interesting conversations I had with somebody actually, for a journal article was a CEO of a company that's doing like real spatial kind of stuff called XYO Labs. Super cool company. And they're building what they described to me as a reality oracle, right? Like, I think part of why I love working in this field is like, Microsoft comes out with something. It's like the new Surface Pro X, right? Here in crypto, you come out with it and it's like the God atom. Right? It's cooler. It's like kind of sexier. I don't know. It's more interesting.
Reality Oracle certainly sounds a lot cooler. And Thomas has got this ongoing idea that he keeps playing with a search engine for the physical world, where you could search for different textures, you could search for different smells, you could search for different like temperature gradients, this sort of thing. It's come up in a couple different podcasts, and I could see the two interfacing in a really interesting way. This could be the technology that would allow a thing like that to exist.
Exactly. Right. And by the way, there's a guy at Harvard, his name I forget, but he's like a big like digitizing smell. Like he's much more important and famous than I am. But if you could get him for your podcast, it would be, I'm sure, an interesting person to talk to.
Digitizing smell.
Yeah. There's a restaurant. Oh shit! It was one of my favorite places in Boston that he used to run that closed. And I'm sure you could Google him with some amount of looking. And if you need help, we can talk offline. But to go back to the reality oracle piece, I had heard the word oracle before in crypto, and I just kind of assumed I knew what it meant because it's like a word. It's like something that predicts the future. Turns out that's not actually what it means. It's a window between on-chain and off-chain, whatever direction it may be pointed. In one of those little like dumb column charts, like Web 2, Web 3, an oracle is like an API. It's more decentralized. The data is theoretically coming from multiple nodes that'll have to like cross-check each other, but in upshot, what it does is take information that isn't on chain and bring it as a feed on chain, right? So you can imagine something like the crypto API of the weather. You could embed smart contracts with something or other, futures, derivatives, et cetera, based on actual weather, right? Okay, cool. It's a compound meteorological and financial instrument. It's kind of interesting. Now imagine you do something that's like your search engine of the actual world, right? It's a mashup of tile for like item tagging, Waze because it's made out of people going places with a coin and wherever, and Google Maps, Waze, tile, like Foursquare kind of also at the same time, and it's got a token system that pays people to move around and go places, and then that data is worth something. They keep a percentage of its worth, and the company keeps a percentage for building the data that built the thing. We all own it ourselves together, et cetera, et cetera. But you can just imagine like extrapolate a successful positive use case around this. We talked about like resolving friction from intermediaries. Imagine you want to send cement somewhere, right? You could imagine money uploaded, put into a digital escrow account, some little crypto tracker activator thing goes on the thing, the cement goes on site automatically, payment gets made, everybody can see what everybody is doing, everybody put their keys in to permit the system to thing, the system did its thing, everybody took their keys back out and they walked away and went away together. How could that transform like the human global infrastructure of like, global supply chain? Probably some. I don't quite know enough about the workings of ports to tell you exactly how much, when and why and where the real unlock's going to be. If I knew that, I would just be out there building that company. But I think you can see there's going to be some hot action, whoever figures out that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So no proof yet, but so I'm a graduate of the University of Chicago, and one of the proud sayings of the University of Chicago is, sure, it works in practice, but what about in theory?
Right. No, I like that approach. I don't know that you don't need a whole lot in the way of prognostication in order to say that if you can dramatically reduce the friction involved in certain kinds of processes, that will speed a lot of things up and allow for a lot of innovation to blossom. That's essentially, I would argue, what the fundamental innovation in the use of money was in the first place. I mean, we don't have to rehash the economics 101 chapters 1 through 5 that we all are familiar with, but it solved the coincidence of wants. It allowed for greater degrees of specialization, and the rest, as they say, is history. And if you could further that in some way, another turn of the screw, it maybe wouldn't be as innovative or as progress-inducing as the invention of money, but it could maybe be in that same order of magnitude.
Or at least another like roll of the bowling ball. You know, like, okay, fine, this isn't money. It's not writing, right? But like email, okay, which had a bigger impact on the history of the world, writing or email? Probably writing, but like, again, they're in conversation with one another. You know, and I also think, too, people overestimate how much change they actually want to see in their own lifetimes. I was talking to a close friend of mine, a very sensitive guy, an artist, very, very knowledgeable, very apprised of blockchain issues. And I think I would, so I know I'm not supposed to talk about politics, but I think I can talk about politics without practicing it. And I think, so I would roughly characterize my friend's political orientation as like the smartest Bernie Sanders voter you ever met. Not my attitudes, but attitudes, consistent attitudes with more math than I'm able to do and follow and question, certainly, right? And certain set of beliefs about how society ought to behave, many of which I have sympathy for and not every one of which I share personally. Okay, fine, you know? And he was sort of trying to have me hold crypto to task for the fact that it was both innovation dusting sprinkled on the old power order and populated by crazy people who want crazy, unrealizable things, and therefore the system is dangerous. And I said, okay, wait a minute. It's changing too fast, it's changing too slow, and it's changing too fast, right? And we're using, since 2008, you know, the beginning of the ecosystem as the benchmark, right? Like, you know, this is like all wrong. Look at, you know, one of my favorite things to encourage, you know, my art history students to do, but the analogy holds here, I think, very well, is go look at some paintings by Giotto. Giotto is sort of the first artist to paint in perspective. That is hugely important, and he's not that great at it. He's just not. One of the beginning lessons of like art history, you know, 102 or whatever, is like you look at a Giotto and you look at another artist from later in the Renaissance and be like, where did they learn? You know, oh, okay, cool. We got the shadows, right? Oh, the perspective actually aligns to the single point. Oh, the light is coming from one consistent zone. You know, the objects are actually sitting on the table. Okay, fine. People figured all that shit out. But still, when you look at the people are in love with that version 1 of the system because they think, oh, it's all inchoate in here, right? If we just look at the Big Bang with a big enough microscope, we'll see every event that will happen all the way after it. It may be, but at what level of granular detail, right? Like you can see the event, you kind of get an idea maybe of what Michelangelo will be able to do 100 and something years later, right? But not really, right? It's not really the same thing. Oh, look at that fucking Michelangelo paint, right? And I think there's a lot of that same logic that applies here where it's like, oh, look at what it promises itself it'll be able to do. Why hasn't it yet done it already? Like, shit, this was science fiction 5 minutes before it became theoretically possible. And we're telling you it's theoretically possible, and we feel it's the direction the world will be moving. You're like, well, why isn't it here yet? Because it didn't exist 5 minutes ago, you know? And how much change do you actually want? Do you have enough confidence that the Uber, Airbnb, Turo car sharing service you're going to use to replace the fire department, the IRS, the public school system, the police, and the highway safety patrol agency at the same time is going to work?
So one of the things I used to describe how the internet has changed our lives is that it's created more awareness. And as we see this new level of awareness, we have more visibility into the things that we're doing. So as an example, in the crypto world, we can see how we can enter moments of payments here and there in our lives that weren't visible in the past because we suddenly have much more awareness about how all of these things are working real time as opposed to hearing about them 2 weeks later.
Yes.
And so that changes kind of the game plan a lot.
100%. So there's a fantastic, for those of your readers who are interested in reading, academic humanities research in my kind of field of origin. It's a great chapter by a brilliant scholar named Bruno Latour called Drawing Things Together. And it is a 60-page exegesis about how the Renaissance gives birth to the scientific revolution. And in essence, what he argues is that what the printing press, engraving, ideas circulating that are coming back in from the Arab world to Renaissance Italy, all of these different things made it possible for researchers to compare their observations with other researchers. That actually is the needle moving factor when you can say, the star is 90 degrees not where somebody else said it ought to be. Why is that? Oh, because there's like a curvature, turns out. That's like interesting, right? All of the consequences that unfold from being able to cross-compare someone else's view of reality with your own against a stable copy. And if now the first time is and in real time, and NFT is some kind of guarantor of stable copy that we actually are looking at the same thing, through other ends of the metaverse telescope, right? Okay. Right? What are the use cases for comparing? How do you even begin to answer a question like that?
Yeah, I like that as a lens. It's often not the thing. Like the genesis of these major upheavals is often not what you would pinpoint it. It's often something that in hindsight looks fairly trivial, or maybe in foresight looked fairly trivial. It's just we now have copies, and I can see that you said this thing, and it turns out to be wrong because I'm looking right at it.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't think that would be such an enormous achievement or an enormous source of change.
What you're describing is the origin of public discourse. It becomes possible to hold a collective opinion about something, right? When you all have read the newspaper, as opposed to you're just hearing what the town crier tells you the king says is true, that's what's true, right? But when you can compare notes, all of a sudden you can talk to each other about what the notes say. Right. And is Twitter helping us do that? Is it harming us because we can do it at such, low transaction cost? Like, I don't know. And I don't know that an opinion about that matters in any kind of real-time way. I think the consequences of this are the interesting thing, and they are almost so fantastical, they're hard to talk about. But what their probability is and what their time frame is also sort of hard to say with any kind of real consistent belief. I don't know. I think it's an interesting time to be in the industry, certainly.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. We've covered
everything.
From weird approach vectors for certain. Now, how much has the kind of the dismal outlook of the crypto world affected you as things kind of crashed last week? And
I think in terms of how it's impacted my work and my view of the industry, I think that there's another. I'll tease a topic from the second issue that I don't know that I'm going to be able. Well, excuse me. I know I'm going to be able to do it. I just don't know if I'm going to be able to do it to the maximalist version of this. So there is a famous crypto Renaissance historian who can go unnamed, who I am cautiously hopeful will be co-writing the piece that I'm describing with you. But if he doesn't turn up to write it, I'm going to write it myself. And it's a written response to a fantastic book that came out maybe 2-3 years ago that I can post a link in the checks. The title of it's escaping me, and I don't want to send people in an Amazon rabbit hole, that looks at the Jamestown colony in Virginia for different kinds of seed kernels of what's going to turn into American democracy, and pays a ton of very compelling, interesting attention to the interpenetration of ideas that were coming from basically lower class whites who were on the boats over there and had kind of, in some ways, fallen out the bottom of their own social order by being sent over on the early colonists. It was like, that was a good chance that something good was going to happen by doing something as dangerous and insane as that. The native peoples who they found themselves in a lot of direct contact with, especially at early moments on a more equal footing that is commonly understood, looking at the thing in the rearview mirror, and runaway slaves who had gotten themselves mixed up in all of this completely against their will and had managed to break free and were running around to a certain extent with the natives, but also bringing other kinds of ideas and patterns. A long, very deep, very interesting book, right? So where does this relate to crypto? The book does an excellent job at tracking how innovations in Britain, namely around the idea of the joint stock company, set up the ground for a revolution they're not going to be prepared politically, culturally, attitudinally to see through the consequences of. So right. They possessed something similar to how what we would understand as venture capitalism, right? So if you're a duke, you can commission a thing, right? Oh, I'm going to commission a voyage. Let's see what the fuck is over there, right? But the idea of commissioning something that was going to go and come back is very different than something that's going to go and stay. You almost need a whole bunch of co-owners of something like that, where it's a one-way ticket. You know, the people getting on a one-way ticket are just not going to do a good job if you absolutely force them to go, right? They have to decide to be there, right? So this is actually, it's a funny, interesting coincidence where the word adventure comes from. So the commoners who would otherwise have zero access to any kind of speculative capital can adventure their bodies, just as the dukes are venturing their treasure. Sweat equity. This is a concept that gets born, right? And then a whole bunch of other things happen. They come into contact with new sort of social organizational patterns that are more consensus-driven than bottom-up. And they say, hey, wait the fuck. We're over here risking our lives for all of this stuff. People that are really getting rich over this are, you know, back in England, and they're making decisions that are bad for everybody because they're not close enough to the situation. The alignment incentives between owners and managers is all fucking wrong here. We ought to be able to pick who's in charge. And then, you know, the American Revolution from there, right? Very interesting, very compelling kind of an argument. And one of the injustices that the author does a good, it's always tough trying to talk about injustices in history, right? But I'll bring the 21st century moral view of the situation to bear on a time period that doesn't apply to, but I think clarify for this conversation. There is a power asymmetry between the dukes and the commoners, right? The commoners have no other choice. You can die miserable and broke on this farm where your kids are sick and whatever, or take your chance and, like, you know, make a man of yourself in the new world kind of thing. It's only one of those has upside. Okay, fine. But the downside, again, is not shared, where the retail trader gets completely wiped the fuck out. And the institutionals, maybe you take one on the nose, but you've got the treasure reserve to hodl, you know, into perpetuity. I think there is a conversation around the enthusiasm for retail adoption and the use of retail traders' money that oftentimes turns into exit opportunities of unknown speculative capability and staying power given to those in some ways who are least prepared to bear them. And I think there is a moral calculus there that needs to be reckoned with more explicitly in the field than is currently being.
I've got to jump. We'll cut this a little bit out. I've got to call the CEO. But you guys can finish up without me. This has been great. I'll email you. I've got some thoughts.
Beautiful. I'm Trent. I'm sorry we're going to miss you for this last section because we're talking about kid stuff. But let's do at least one more thing that I would love to jam was.
All right. Let's. This has been a fascinating discussion about approaching lots of these topics from multiple different angles. What is it that gives you hope in the industry? What is it that that you can clearly see on the horizon that this is taking us towards something better than what we have right now?
It's interesting. It's like you ask two questions at the same time, right? It's like, what gives you hope and what evidence do you have? It's like faith and demonstration are not necessarily the same thing. I think that taking crypto out of the equation, there are issues that are clearly fundamental, like, problems in our world, right? To me, absolute top of the top is climate. We haven't talked really about Bitcoin mining, ways to transition to greener, staking mechanisms, all of these different things. I have a piece coming out about that. It's something I think it's always important to sort of call out as a big near-term solve the industry needs to, again, come to terms with. I think that bracketing aside Bitcoin, which actually doesn't put out nearly as much carbon dioxide as you would imagine. I found a comparable that put it, so the standard quoted, amount is around 40 or 50 megatons of carbon dioxide, which sounds like a lot. It's a lot. I found a study on golf courses that said a professionally maintained, mega scale golf course puts out about 2 megatons of carbon dioxide per year. So it turns out there's like 24 PGA golf courses. And it seems, to my scanning of the literature, that Bitcoin emits as much carbon dioxide as the PGA. And one of them is not the linchpin of a new global, more inclusive financial order. One of them is a golf tour, right? Okay. So there are issues around e-waste that are not fully attended to this. This is like not at all to dismiss the environmental problems, but simply to note that problems are being grappled with. Problems are maybe not in proportion as they're commonly understood, and problems need to be addressed in order for the industry to move forward in its best way possible. But given that those kind of things can be, solved within Bitcoin, they haven't been solved in the planet, right? Let's say you solve Bitcoin for the environment. Have you solved shipping for the environment? Have you solved like the rising global middle class for the environment? I don't think so. And I think that it's become increasingly hard for me to imagine solutions to these big societal problems in which crypto is not a part of addressing them, right? I think the idea of a registration system for carbon credits so that everybody can see where these things are going, who paid for how much of them, and et cetera, put as much of this on the blockchain with real-time public visibility as possible, that's probably good for the public good, just as a new bit of infrastructure. And one of the things that I like about that is it's not trying to put the fire department out of business, right? The fire department works just fine. We don't need a DAO-based fire department. We just have the fire department, right? But a DAO-based global climate DAO that supervised carbon emissions might do a better job than the UN. I mean, they might not, but they might, right? And it seems like, okay, here, that's upside I might kind of want to try to buy in on, right? Another kind of similar one that is maybe less obvious, but I've just become more interested in it, is around the idea of pseudonymous identity. So I am advising a startup I helped a friend found, now like step back from day-to-day operations, and we got to hire people, right? So just as a little backdrop on the team, brilliant team, absolutely love him. Everybody I think I just would vouch for as a human in every best way possible. I am a white guy. My co-founder is Chinese. He brought on our 2 CTOs who are Chinese. We're bringing on one other white guy that I happen to be friends with. And that's what our team is. And we thought, oh, that's not great. So we needed to hire, right? We knew we needed to hire diversity, and we were cultivating it and reaching out to people we thought we would have diverse contacts, all of this, doing everything we could to try to not be loud allies, but just allies that just showed up and did the fucking work, And it became interesting to me when we got resumes with a CryptoPunk on the top and an Ether address on the top. I thought, how do I know? How do I know if I can do good by hiring a minority person here? And I thought, well, wait a minute, turn that problem around now. What if I'm just a hiring manager and now I can't see, is this person a woman? Is this person old? Is this person a certain race or not? All I get is an Ether scan and a profile pic and maybe some blockchainified LinkedIn work history or something like that. Yeah. Right? Okay, is Bitcoin, is crypto, is Web3 going to solve discrimination? No, probably not. Is anything going to solve discrimination? No, probably not at a fundamental human level, right? And yet, what has non-blockchain managed to do about this? Okay, we've got all these like diversity and equity and inclusion committees, which are doing good work and are needed and part of why this is going to have the traction that it needs, right? But I am friends with many people that work in that industry. I follow a lot of them on LinkedIn. They're perpetually voicing frustration with their own inability to force companies to adhere to the publicly stated goals they worked hard with them to help them craft, right? Okay, I think the blockchain looks like a means of doing that. It looks like a means of creating public accountability where heretofore there had been trust and invisibility rhetoric, right? Okay, sure. Did Bitcoin solve discrimination? No. Did it introduce a new, potentially useful tool that is going to take us to an extent we've never been able to take until now? Possibly. That's kind of why I work in the field,
Yeah, that's actually a great answer because it gives us new tool sets to see the future in an entirely different way.
Yep.
Well, Well, Michael, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion here. I appreciate you taking the time to let us get a glimpse of inside your mind, which is going like 1,000 miles an hour all the time. And
so my wife tells me.
I find this absolutely fascinating. So thank you for coming on our show, and I really appreciate you taking this time today to be with us.